Okay, viewers, what we're looking at here is the 100 years old Flying Scotsman. She's an A1 Pacific Gresley design. She's a 261 locomotive, which means she has 2 wheels under the front pony truck below the cylinders there. You have 6 driving wheels and 1 pony truck under the cab. She also is a 3-cylinder locomotive, and she's fresh to Train Sim World 4. So let's jump in and have a look. Hello, fireman, how are you? Get this door closed. Just jump in the chair. Always jump in the chair first thing. Conveniently over here behind the fireman's leg somewhere, if I can find it, is the AWS isolation switch. So let's turn AWS on and acknowledge. Excuse my jerky movements. We also have our cylinder cock lever down there. And they're currently open, which is the right thing when we're standing still. The cylinder cocks exhaust the water out of the cylinders that's condensed from the steam so that you don't blow your end caps off. Our doors are currently open. Let's just do a quick gauge glass test, as you always would when you're hopping into a locomotive. All right, the water rises smartly in the glass. Let's check the other one and make sure they are equal. And the water rises smartly in the glass in that one. There's a bunch of other controls up there you don't need to worry too much about. Let's have a look at the whistle though. It is a nice whistle. The reason you don't have to worry about the other controls is they're all about firing, and you can't really manually fire in this game anyway. The gauges, we have our steam chest pressure, oddly, which is at about 40 pounds right now. I would have thought it would be at 0 with the regulator at 0, but there you go. We have our speedometer at 0 miles per hour. We have our train vacuum gauge, which is showing we have no vacuum in the train, which is a good thing because we're running air brakes. You can hear the air brake compressor panting away behind me. We have got the brake cylinder pressure, so we have a strong application on it at the moment. And that's reflected again in the brake pipe gauge over here, where the brake pipe is down to about 50-odd, 60 pounds, and the main air reservoir is a bit over 120. That's pumping up quite happily. Just check our handbrake is off, which is good. In the box there's a GSMR phone and device. They're not actually usable yet. And I like to turn on the cab light up here by clicking on it, just so when we go into a tunnel or something like that we can still see in the cab. We've got our locomotive brake, which you can apply and release. It's not linked to Rail Driver if you're using Rail Driver. And we've got the train brake, which is currently in neutral or shutdown. So let's just lock our passenger doors and we will release this brake. And I'll take you through the different positions. You saw it go into release or charge and release. It's now in running. And we'll move into, they call it initial application, then they go through percentages. I would call it a service application. That's okay. And you can go right round into emergency if you want to. But we do actually want to release them. So let's just release the brakes, and we're going to put the reverser into full forwards gear. And as the brakes start to release, they'll take a little while. We will open the regulator just a little. Let's go up to about 10% or so. 12's fine. And we'll pop outside the locomotive and watch what's happening. You can see there's steam starting to eject out of these cylinder cocks. And we're starting to move. And you can see all the other cylinders taking over. And you keep your cylinder cocks open until the first couple of chuffs. Or in real life, you'd be listening for the sound of the steam to listen whether it's wet or dry and all sorts of things like that. But in the game, a few chuffs and you can close your cocks with the C key or your controller or whatever you like. So let's just go back into the cab now. We're starting to pick up a little bit of speed. We're getting up on 5 miles an hour. Now at this point we're only using boiler pressure to move because we're not using the expansive nature of the steam. So we want to be a bit more efficient than that so that our fireman doesn't bean us over the head with a shovel. So let's bring the reverser back into the mid-50s for the moment, and let's bring our regulator gently up to about 25%. We'll just let that accelerate for a little while. So that's using less steam, strangely, even though we've opened the regulator, because we've also moved the reverser. And the closer you move it to the middle, the more efficient it gets, but also the less overall power you've got. So you use the higher power settings where you're using more steam to build up your speed. So now that we're getting up on some decent speed, things will be warming through. We can open the regulator up a little more. You want to be gentle and slow with a steam engine. And we can bring our reverser back more towards mid-gear. Let's get her into the low 30s if we can. Rail driver's being a little finicky today. We'll just stick with 35 then. We're coming up into the 75 zone. We are quite smartly making speed now. We're approaching 20 miles an hour. Steam engines do accelerate quite slowly. Don't expect it to take off like a race car. They just don't. You'll notice our brake pipe pressure is risen up to almost 80. Excuse my voice, I do have a bit of a cold. And you can also see in our brake gauge here that she's come down to 0, so the brakes are fully off. We are accelerating quite happily now. So we can open our regulator up. Let's take it up to about, it's nice and slow, up to about 60%. And we will keep on accelerating. She does have quite a sharp, high-pitched staccato beat. This is quite a realistic beat for the Scotsman. And at slow speeds you'll hear nice clanking from the motion, and you'll hear the air compressor panting and things like that. At high speed you really don't hear those things so much. Everything just sort of becomes a dull roar in the cab of a steam engine as you accelerate. So I'm quite happy with the sounds on this locomotive. I'm also quite happy with the physics and the performance. It's quite realistic. So we can quite happily just keep our regulator in this position, and she will just keep gradually speeding up even though we're going uphill. We can open it up a little bit more. And she will eventually get up to a decent cruising speed of about 60 to 65, 70 mile an hour. She emits quite a nice blast of smoke and steam. Looks quite appropriate to me. Like all the steam engines in Train Sim World, it tends to suffer a little bit of safety valvitis, but quite fortunately the safety valve has been made a little bit quiet, so it's not as annoying as it could be. What about drifting? So you'll notice on the back wall here, there's a little sign that tells you about when you're coasting, you need to go to 25% cutoff. So if we're cruising along and we decide that we are actually going fast enough, so let's say we only wanted to do 50 mile an hour, so we can bring, and we're going downhill now, so we can bring our regulator back, right back down. You don't quite close it though, and we'll just bring our regulator back a little, sorry, our reverser back a little bit more towards mid-gear. There we go. That'll do, near enough. So it wants you to be in about 25% cut-off when you're just drifting along. Now the reason I don't close the regulator completely is the steam is what's actually carrying the lubricating oil into the cylinders. So it's helping keeping everything nice and wet and lubricated, so that nothing bad happens and that you don't overheat your cylinders and blow end caps off and seize things up and crack castings and all that sort of thing. It's not actually modelled that way in the game, but it's just good driving practice. So what if you wanted to stop at this point? Well, you can just start applying your trade brake. So this isn't quite the service positions I'm used to on the brake handle, so let's just put it into service. Well, it's gone into full service, thank you, rail driver. And as we're coming down to a stop, we'll keep the regulator just cracked for the moment. And as we're pulling back to a stop, you can actually close the regulator. And in reality, you probably actually kick off the brakes as well, just so you stop smoothly. So getting started again, it's the same thing. We've only just stopped. We don't need to worry too much about the cylinder cocks at this point. So let's release the brakes. Let's get our reverser back into full forward gear again. And while the brakes are coming off, that will actually be a little while. They come off on the train pretty quickly, on the locomotive pretty quickly, I mean, but not the train. Whoops, she's trying to spin because the brakes are still on in the train. They're still coming off. And you'll notice I was admonished for not having the cylinder cocks open then. Strictly speaking, that's not really true, because if you're just stopping briefly, you don't actually open them up again. You can, but you don't have to. But the driver assist did admonish me. Well, before anybody points it out that the buffers aren't textured, they are. That's called quartering. That is actually quite normal, and if you look at pictures of Flying Scotsman, that is what she looks like. Alright, so once again we're going to bring our reverser back into the mid-40s, and we're going to slowly open the regulator up again. And we're going to get our train moving again. Well, that's pretty much the basics of operating Flying Scotsman. If you come across an adverse signal, you acknowledge it with the AWS lever. You do have Sanders, which I notice are keyed to the alert button, so I'll report that. This is an early access version. Perhaps that will be fixed in the release version. We shall see. And we're gradually accelerating again, so let's once again bring our reverser back into the low 30s. There we go. And open the regulator back up. Just nice and slow, nice and gentle. Always be gentle with a steam engine. Let them take their time. Let them take their time and they will reward you well. Well, that's about it for the basics of driving the Flying Scotsman, so we shall leave her to go on her merry way, and I shall bid you goodbye. If you've got any comments or questions, ask them down below, and if you find this helpful, have a look in the Train Sim World Tutorials playlist I've got, and subscribe to the channel. Alrighty, thanks a lot, see you later.